The Catechism now turns to the 10 Commandments in particular, grouping them in two. First, the commandments having to do with love of God, the first three. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength and all your soul. These first three commandments will be treated, and then the remaining 7 are treated under the heading, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So, the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. What does this mean, to worship God alone? Let's look at what the Catechism has to say. God's first demand is that of acceptance and worship. Notice that God makes this demand only after He has led the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. He puts upon them the obligation to honor Him alone only after He has shown His fidelity and shown His mercy through the event of the Exodus. God's first commandment is linked with man's vocation to make God manifest by acting in conformity with His creation in the image and likeness of God. Faith, hope, and love are embraced by the first commandment. Faith, to say God, is to profess a being who is unchanging and always good. Hope, God is almighty and merciful, worthy of our hope. And love, God has poured out His love upon us and is worthy of our love. Faith, hope, and love are the theological virtues, those virtues that lead us to God. And so let's see how faith, hope, and love shed light upon the first commandment. Faith, of course, is a gift from God. Through faith we come to believe. Through faith we come to know the Lord our God. Through faith we come to accept His promises. The first commandment requires that we nourish and protect our faith with vigilance, and that we reject all that is opposed to it. Ways of violating this commandment are as follows: voluntary doubt, disregarding or refusing to hold as true what God has revealed and the Church proposes for belief; involuntary doubt, hesitating to believe, or having difficulty in overcoming objections connected with the faith. And while not sinful in itself, one can become spiritually blind by deliberately cultivating doubt. Heresy and apostasy are also ways in which the first commandment is violated. Heresy, the denial of some aspect of the belief of the Church; apostasy, separation from the Church; and schism as well, the refusal to submit to the authority of the Roman pontiff. These are all violations of the first commandment. We shall love the Lord our God, and we shall love Him above all else. We shall have no strange gods before Him. Hope in God is necessary to respond to God's call, for man cannot fully respond to God's love with his own power. Hope is about believing that the promises of God will be fulfilled, especially His ultimate promises, the promise to take care of us for all eternity, the promise that our eternal soul is in good hands when placed in His loving care. Sins against the first commandment that have to do with hope include despair, despairing of God's mercy, despairing in everlasting life, looking at this world as all that there is, not believing, not trusting that there is heaven in store for those who hope in God. Despair is one sin against the first commandment, having to do with the theological virtue of hope, and so is presumption. presumption of God's mercy, presumption that no matter what we do, everything will be okay, presumption that it doesn't really matter what kind of life we live, that somehow God's mercy will wash away every sin, every stain, even though we are not sorry, even though we have never expressed regret or contrition. This is a presumption on God's mercy, despair and presumption. Oddly enough, of those two, despair is the greater of the two, the greater sin, because despair goes against God's nature. Presumption goes with God's nature to be merciful, though taking it to an extreme that is sinful. Charity is the third theological virtue. We are obliged by the first commandment to respond to God's love by loving God above everything and all creatures for Him and because of Him. We can sin against charity and thus sin against the first commandment in the following ways: through indifference, neglecting or refusing to reflect upon the goodness and power of God's love; ingratitude, failing or refusing to acknowledge and respond to God's love; lukewarmness, hesitating or neglecting to respond to God's love. It can imply refusal to give oneself over to the prompting of charity; spiritual sloth, refusing the joy that comes from God and being repelled by God's goodness; and hatred of God that comes from pride. It is contrary to love of God, whose goodness it denies, and whom it presumes to curse as the one who forbids sins and inflicts punishment. So the first commandment speaks about honoring God as the only God, and Him alone shall you serve. How do we serve the Lord? How do we keep the first commandment? By serving Him. The virtue of religion disposes us to possess an attitude of rendering to God what is His due. Remember that the virtue of justice has to do with giving the other his or her due. A transaction in a store, we give a certain amount of money and we are entitled in justice to walk away with the item that we have just purchased, giving to the other his or her due. The virtue of religion is part of the virtue of justice, inasmuch as it consists of giving to God what is His due. What are the things that are due to God? First of all, adoration. To adore God is to acknowledge Him as God, the Creator and Savior, the Lord and Master of everything that exists, as infinite and merciful love. To adore God is to humble oneself, as Mary did in the Magnificat, praising God for all that He has done. The worship of the one God sets man free from turning in on himself, from the slavery of sin and idolatry of the world. So adoration is one way in which we keep the first commandment. Prayer is another way. Prayer being the opening of one's heart to the Lord. And the fourth part of the Catechism treats prayer and goes into great lengths speaking of prayer. What is prayer? Prayer is the lifting up of one's mind to God in adoration. Prayer includes praise and thanksgiving, intercession and petition. Prayer is an indispensable condition for being able to obey God's commandments. Other ways of serving the Lord and keeping the first commandment include sacrifice, making of our every day a sacrifice to God, choosing to put Him first, choosing to do without some of the things that we like, some of the things that we prefer, choosing to abandon our will to His divine providence. Sacrifice is a way of keeping the first commandment. Promises and vows, when we make a promise and keep that promise in good faith, when we keep any vows that we have made, these are ways of keeping the first commandment by taking seriously our obligations that we have incurred through promises and vows. Fidelity to promises made to God is a sign of the respect owed to the divine majesty and of love for a faithful God. Such promises are made at baptism, confirmation, matrimony, and holy orders, and out of personal devotion. A vow is a deliberate and free promise made to God concerning a possible and better good, which must be fulfilled by reason of the virtue of religion. We keep the first commandment by honoring the religious freedom of others. All have a duty that stems from the dignity of the human person to seek and embrace the truth about God. This duty to preserve religious freedom does not contradict the sincere respect for other religions, which frequently reflect a ray of the truth which enlightens all men. This duty does not contradict the requirement of charity, which requires Christians to treat with love, prudence, and patience those who are in error of ignorance in regard to the faith. Evangelization is a way of keeping the first commandment, sharing the faith that we have received with our neighbors, helping to infuse our culture, the culture in which we live, with the presence of the Lord, the wisdom of the gospel, seeking to bring Christ into every facet of our human existence. The social duty of Christians is to respect and awaken in each man the love of the true and the good. It requires them to make known the worship of the one true religion which subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church. In so doing, Christians are the light of the world, showing forth the kingship of Christ over all creation, and in particular over human societies. Due limits must be determined for each social situation by political prudence, according to the requirements of the common good, and ratified by the civil authority in accordance with legal principles, which are in conformity with the objective moral order.